is going on in Washington right now. Something that'll catch the average American completely off guard and will be dangerous to their financial well-being.
That's right, Bob. In short, I think that we're in line for one of the most drastic and draconian changes to the U.S. money system in history. It could be on a par with the creation of the Fed in 1913, or Roosevelt confiscating American citizens' gold in 1933, or Johnson taking silver out of the U.S. coinage in 1965, or Nixon devaluing the dollar and cutting it loose from gold in 1971.
Doug, I've tracked your career closely since you wrote your best-selling book, Crisis Investing, back in 1979. I know you're not one of those gurus who make huge predictions just to get in the spotlight. When you make a prediction, more often than not, history has proven you right. For example, in your book, you warned corporations would go belly up on a massive scale, but that the government would bail out those which are most inefficient. Sure enough, the S&L crisis ensued with over 1,000 bankruptcies, followed by the Bush bailout in 1989.
Well, a good economist, among other things, anticipates not only the immediate and direct consequences of government actions, but the indirect and delayed consequences as well. Unfortunately, most of the economic pundits you read about are actually just political apologists.
Doug, you've issued at least one major prediction in each of the last 4 decades. Let's take a quick look. In 1989, 9 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall, you wrote, "The Soviets are likely to see their country break up into its many constituent parts over the next few decades." November 1999, 4 months before the NASDAQ lost over 60%, you said, "Almost every one of the internet stocks is a burning match." You said we'd see, quote, "a 95% plus meltdown among the survivors, with many disappearing totally." Amazon, one of the survivors you specifically mentioned, was overpriced at the time, fell 93% over the next 18 months. Uncanny. But it's not all gloom and doom. The same year, you made a strong call for gold. You wrote, "I think the price of gold is at the bottom, and over the next few years, it's not just going through the roof, but to the moon." Sure enough, gold was trading for $259 at the time, but it eventually rose to $1,900, offering those who followed your advice the chance to turn $10,000 into more than $72,000. Lastly, in 2005, 2 years before the housing crash, you issued this public statement. You said, "What's going on now in the residential real estate market is much like the tech bubble, but potentially much more serious than what went on in stocks a few years ago. The bubble is floating on a sea of debt. When it bursts, millions of houses will hit the market in distress sales." This was another warning that could have helped millions of Americans steer clear of disaster. Now, Doug, I'm not going to list all the predictions you've ever made, but these showcase why financial author Robert Ringer has called you one of the great prophets of our time, and why Simon & Schuster has stated you've never been wrong on one of your major predictions. Phil Donahue even once devoted a full hour-long show to your work. Today we're going to discuss the subject of your research firm's latest book, Surviving FedCoin, which outlines what may be your most shocking prediction yet. If you're right about this, like you've been in the past, the consequences could be devastating for most Americans. The savings of millions could be drastically reduced, and it could spell the end of one of our most cherished liberties.
Well, Bob, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not a fortune teller, but I believe that in the real world, cause has effect and actions have consequences. So the key is to position yourself. Sometimes it takes a few years for the inevitable to become imminent.
Okay, Doug, let's just dive right into it. It's crazy out there. Now, what is going on?
I believe that we entered the Greater Depression in 2007. We entered, compare it to a gigantic financial hurricane. And what we experienced in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010 was the leading edge of this gigantic financial hurricane. And now, for the last 6 years, we've been in the eye of the storm. I believe at this point, we're entering the trailing edge of the hurricane, and it's going to be much different, much worse, and much longer lasting than the turbulence we experienced back in 8 and 9. The eye of the storm was caused by governments around the world, not just the US government, but the Europeans, the Chinese, the Japanese, all of them, and minor governments as well, creating trillions and trillions of currency units that they cast upon this financial hurricane like oil on water. And it made things seem better than they were. It made people feel that they were richer than they were for this last 6 years in the eye of the storm. But it's going to be, I think, the biggest upset in economic history, much bigger and much worse than what we experienced during the last Great Depression from 1929 to 1945.
Worse than the 29 depression?
Yes.
How bad can this get?
The bond market is in a super bubble at this point, not just a bubble. The real estate market, which floats on a sea of debt at these very low interest rates, is in another bubble. The stock market, it's a speculation at this point. People forget that in between 1929 and 1932, the stock market collapsed 93%. When the banking crisis hit Cyprus 3 years ago, this is rather unbelievable, but it's true. The stock market in Cyprus collapsed almost 99%. So anything is possible in circumstances like this. In 2008, in September, it's acknowledged by members of the Federal Reserve that we came within hours of a total collapse of the financial system. AIG, Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, commercial banks, they came within hours of a total collapse. Why? Well, one of the reasons why is, as Warren Buffett has pointed out, there are about, at this point, much more than there were back in 2007 and 8. There are about $1 quadrillion worth of derivatives. These are very complex contracts that one financial institution owes another, who sells it on to the next one, who sells it on to the next one. It's a gigantic daisy chain. And if just one of these institutions can't make a payment, the next guy can't make a payment, and the next guy. And when you go to redeem or cash your paycheck at Citibank or whoever, what are they going to give you? They're bankrupt because of the people not being able to pay them. This is how it all comes down, and the banks actually close. This is what the fractional reserve system is about. The US at this point is a ticking time bomb from a financial, from an economic, from a sociological, from a political point of view. It's a very dangerous situation. I'm not talking about 5 years or 10 years from now. I'm talking about going back into the trailing edge of the storm in a matter of months.
So let's talk about this change in the US money system. Doug, what do you believe is going to happen?
Well, the monetary system itself is extremely unstable. And money is the lifeblood of an economy. And you poison the monetary system, it's like getting blood poisoning. It'll kill you eventually. We're seeing this now. The dollar has lost about 97% of its value since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. That trend is not only going to continue, but at this point it's going to accelerate rapidly. One of the things that's helped a lot recently is the fact that it's the world's reserve currency. There are about 10 trillion US dollars outside of the US. This is a big problem because the major export of the United States for the last 30 years has been dollars. The nice Japanese send us Sonys and Toyotas, and the nice Germans send us Mercedes, and we basically just print up dollars and send it to them. That's how $10 trillion got outside of the US. It used to be that just after World War II, all of the skyscrapers in the world, 80% of the aircraft production in the world, 80% of the automobile production in the world, 75% of the steel production in the world, 75% of the stock market value in the world. It was all in America. America was the end-all, the be-all. It was the king of the hill. Now, none of these things are true anymore. The standard of living of the average American peaked in the mid-1950s. Let's say 1959, when the 1959 Cadillac with its fins and twin bullet taillights came out. And if it peaked then it started heading down in earnest in about 1971 with the devaluation of the dollar. And unfortunately, the dollar rests on nothing more than confidence because it's an IOU nothing. And the US government, make no mistake, is bankrupt. Its liabilities far, far exceed its assets. So when the confidence blows away, the first people to dump the dollar are going to be foreigners. And all those dollars, the 10 trillion abroad, are going to come back into the United States in exchange for what? Share certificates, titles to real estate, to companies, to real goods, to Boeings, to IBMs. And the dollars are going to come in. I mean, inflation could explode in this country. It's a very, very unstable situation from many points of view.
So, Doug, a number of countries are already abandoning the dollar. I've read about a trade agreement. 25 countries recently struck deals to trade outside the dollar. China and Russia reached a $400 billion energy deal to trade outside the dollar. This is a trend that's in place right now, and you expect that to...
It's a trend that's accelerating, actually, because at this point, when the Russians trade with the Chinese, which they do, what do they use? They use US dollars, but the US government is an enemy of both. They can see the illogic of trading with each other and having it clear through New York. At the same time, the Iranians trade with the Indians. A lot of big traders around the world that are using the dollar because it's kind of the world's currency. But that's going to end because none of them trust the dollar anymore. The dollar's got a half-life. It's an IOU nothing on the part of the US government, which the whole world increasingly sees is bankrupt. Social Security itself is bankrupt. 47% of the people in this country are net recipients of tax money from the government. Okay? Officially, 1/3 of all the US government's assets are student loans. Little known fact, about $1 trillion worth of them.
Wow.
I wonder how much of that particular asset is ever going to be paid back.
Yeah.
So it's going to reach its intrinsic value. And unfortunately, since the dollar is backed by nothing, and we're running massive deficits every year, even during these relatively good times since 2010, I'm afraid that the dollar is going to be destroyed. And this is a big problem for Americans that are saving in dollars. Because if you're a productive citizen, you produce more than you consume, you save. What do you save? You save dollars. And if the government destroys the dollar quickly, not just gradually as has been going on for decades, you're going to be out of luck. So you've got to do something about it. You've got to prepare for this eventuality.
So from everything you've described, Doug, it sounds like our currency and the monetary system in general is in real trouble.
It's in very big trouble. Look, during the entire 19th century, which was the greatest sustained period of growth in world history of any country in the United States, the dollar was completely stable. The dollar was defined as 1/20th of an ounce of gold. The price level was completely stable, even going down during that time, which encouraged people to save, which is a good thing. Then the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. Now, it made it possible for all kinds of strange things to happen in the banking system. That resulted, the creation of the Federal Reserve resulted directly in the credit collapse deflationary depression of 1929 to 1945.
So, Doug, what do you actually see happening with the dollar?
My thought is this, that understanding that the dollar is as unstable as it is, at this point, the Fed might try to create an alternative, and an alternative that's more under their control than the dollar and actually out of the traditional banking system. What would happen if the Federal Reserve created a look-alike dollar? Let's call it the Fed coin. Perhaps based on the same technology that Bitcoin is based on. This is the blockchain technology where every transaction can be tracked from the creation of the Bitcoin itself. I suspect the next stage on the part of the government, since they've tried quantitative easing, can't do that too much more after creating trillions and trillions of these paper dollars, which are going to come out of the financial system and into the retail system, exploding prices. Zero interest rates, negative interest rates, huge distortions. That's going to come to an end. What are they going to do next as we enter the trailing edge of the hurricane and everybody will say, do something, do something? Well, what can they do? They've used their two major tools so far. My guess is they're going to come up with a completely digital currency called the Fed coin, which will actually act as a parallel alternative to the dollar.